Okay, so I'm going to begin if you'd like to follow along with the slides. The first slide, titled German and English, has the purpose for the study information, which is analogous to the abstract and introduction parts of the paper project. And the purpose for the study is to look at both German and English as L1 and German and English as L2, and research centered around both languages in both positions as L1 and L2 in order to find potential problems with transfer, with linguistics, with syntax, etc., grammatical usage, etc., when learning English or learning German as an English or German speaker. And not only potential problems, but the scope of the research is going to open up to where there are some positives included as well. So Bialystok discusses German has language learners that speak German as an L1 show benefit when they're learning language with gendered nouns and pronouns. Now, English does not have gendered nouns and pronouns, so this exposes a potential difficulty there. Clausen and Hong studied German L2 learners through reaction time experiments in order to see if there is a universal grammar present, basically. And they studied 33 German L2 language learners to demonstrate that subject-verb agreement and null subject usage are two separate and independent areas within L2 acquisition. That's what they hit on. So that's a very specific research study, but it is applicable in learning, transferring between English and German, because there are differences in the way that null subjects are used between the two language and subject-verb agreement, etc. So that raises potential concerns between the two as well. Dittmar, through a spectrum of language performance, Dittmar analyzes data to answer three questions. Do grammatical markers develop from independent lexical items in child language? Do the markers initially mark pragmatic categories before being grammaticalized as synectic functions? And do grammaticalizations of L1 influence the development of the second language? And so German language learning, both as L1 and L2, is included in that research study, and Dittmar found that pragmatic categories precede syntactic ones in L2 acquisition, grammatical markers develop out of lexical items in L2 acquisition, and transfer plays a role, though minor compared to the other two, in both adult and child L2 acquisition. Duffield focuses exclusively on German language child acquisition, or German-speaking child language acquisition, and it expands on several research studies, basically studying null subjects and finite clauses. So it redoes those studies and expands the scope. And child learners switching to a more adult grammatical and lexical set as time goes on. They do so in a scaffolded way and not all at once. Dijkstra Pruum replicated and extended a study done by Philips Boma, where they collected data from Calvin College by testing undergraduate German L2 learners from 2nd to 8th semester, and found that there was improvement in L2 German learners' understanding of German pluralization alongside an increase in German study, and that second language acquisition tendencies can be observed in L2 production of German pluralization, specifically as knowledge is expanded, and it manifests particularly in reliance on singular conjugations to infer plural conjugation. So again, some more studies on singular and plural, and that pluralization expands the knowledge of pluralization and predictive power of predicting whether unknown words, what the pluralization of those will be, expand as post-secondary education expands and continues and becomes more advanced. So that's incredibly helpful as well for the teacher of German as an L2 from English speakers. HOP article number 1 this is from a very unique perspective, since Hopp is a professor at the University of Mannheim in Germany. He did real-time data collection involving asking questions and recording those responses that they answered immediately, and found that L2 learners whose L1 does not encode grammatical gender can nonetheless use syntactic determiners in the form of noun-gender agreement mastery to predict future grammatical genderization, and that's across all levels of German conjugation. So this is incredibly helpful, pairing up nicely with some research earlier to show how English learners can overcome grammatical genderization, which we do not have in English. HOP number 2 discusses the development of L2 morphology. This is a little bit more broad because he finds that morphological forms must be acquired and stored in the mental lexicon, and then forms must be mated with the correct interpretations of those forms. The forms have to be systematically retrieved in future correct contexts habitually, and then finally the learner has to be able to describe the functions that allow for correct production in these contexts. So not only be able to learn and then repeat, but explain why these work in the correct contexts. And that really demonstrates mastery over the morphological forms. And he found that again through some empirical research. Ione and Co. and Wechsler lays out the studies of article parameters in English. Article parameters in English are sometimes difficult for English second language speakers. They studied Russian, Samoan, German, and Korean English L2 learners and found that those who understood articles best are L1 speakers of languages closest to English. So again, German has that advantage, which is good to keep in mind. Meisel, Elsig, and Rinke did a study and expanded on studies done in previous chapters of the book. So this is a chapter in a book. The book has scaffolded chapters, building one on top of the other, and this one studied if primarily German-speaking children, and which was more advantageous, to be simultaneously bilingual, so learning German and another language, particularly English, for our purposes at the same time, or to be monolingual and then learn an L2 later in life. And they found that learning an L2 later on in childhood had roughly the same analogous steps as learning two at the same time. So you save more time essentially doing both at the same time, but the same steps are accomplished, and really net meaning is not lost as long as the L2 study is relatively intensive if it happens later on in childhood. And then Ringbaum did a cross-linguistic similarity in foreign language learning study, and now this one doesn't involve German, but it does involve Swedish and Finnish speakers who were learning to speak English as an L2. And what this study established was that language is closer in linguistic family, so in this case Swedish and English were closer, being Germanic Indo-European languages. They had more positive transfer and less negative transfer than Finnish English L2 learners did. And so that really goes to show that that German, which is even closer, one could assume research-wise that it would work even better and have more positive transference and less negative transference. And then to conclude where we go from here, both learners and teachers should take this. The scope of the research is relatively broad, and it's broad. I designed it that way. It covers a lot of areas. It covers plurals, it covers genderization, covers noun and pronoun usage, article usages in English, and it covers both German and English in both L1 and L2 positions to try to find positives and negatives. And that's so that if you're teaching and if you're learning either language in either position, you have an opportunity to formulate your own toolbox with this information. This is a foundational set of research. Now, 10 research studies is not a lot, especially when compared to like a book or a research-heavy article on a subject such as this. I mean, they're going to have dozens and dozens of research studies. So the goal was to capture as much information from as many realms as possible to kind of head off a lot of common issues that happen with language learning and with transference and with communicative competence and lexical understanding and comprehension. So these particular common problems were found and talked about, so that the teacher and the learner can have a good basis from which to begin. Now, the researcher also has a good basis from which to begin, because the researcher has the duty of now expanding on this research, replicating and expanding the scope. In the Ringbaum study, for example, was included, which had Swedish and English, so that it could be replicated with perhaps German to prove the assumed conclusion that I had there. And then to show that this research is not only applicable to German and English, but it has cross-linguistic applications as well. And so it's useful for a variety of people, a variety of speakers, in a variety of places. And hopefully through a variety of times. It'll continue to be useful in the future, especially if this broad research is used as a jumping off point for future research. So it's a broad swath of research and research areas for 2 specific languages primarily, to show the pluses and minuses of linguistics and communicative competence and transfer, etc., between both languages as L1 and both languages as L2. And this forms a very solid foundation from which you can teach, from which you can research, and from which, most importantly, you can learn, even while doing all 3. Thank you. Have a great evening. I enjoyed the class.